Okay, so Michael Lafferty, can you tell us please from your own experience and knowledge, what is an entrepreneur?
An entrepreneur is somebody who creates a business virtually out of nothing. These people very often come from disadvantaged backgrounds of one kind or another. Very often they might be immigrants, so I think there's more chance of the immigrants to Ireland being successful entrepreneurs than there is of the comfortably brought up middle and upper classes here in Ireland, for example. But an entrepreneur doesn't inherit a business. An entrepreneur doesn't get finance easily made available to him or her. And by the way, around about half of entrepreneurs now in developed countries are women, which is a very good thing.
Now, let's talk about the world of finance, particularly and banking, because in banking particularly, you've had the notion of what we now call startup businesses, mostly in the area of fintech.
Yeah.
What's your understanding of the relationship between entrepreneurship and fintech, say, / startup area?
Well, I'm sure there are lots of entrepreneurs around in the fintech field. But I get quite concerned about fintech businesses that are relying upon outsiders for finance right from the start. I'm not quite sure what they are, but one thing for sure is they are not entrepreneurs. And there's also this weird language that's grown up around fintech, which sort of says that anybody who can do funny things with coding and so forth is an entrepreneur. They are absolutely not an entrepreneur, because they haven't created anything. So an entrepreneur is about creating a business that can survive over the years, over decades.
Okay. What about, for example, people who run mutuals and professional firms?
I don't think that partners in a professional law firm or an accounting firm or doctors for that matter, are dentists. I don't think they are entrepreneurs at all. They are a different category of people. They're not risk takers in the same way as somebody who creates something out of nothing. So not entrepreneurs at all, and mutuals like credit unions and so forth, laudable businesses, but not entrepreneurs.
Okay, let's take another category then. What about people who, for example, inherit a family business and take it on?
I think they're managers. They're business managers, and you need them too. By the way, I think every good entrepreneur needs to, fairly early on in the process, bring on board some pretty good managers. But when the business moves on to the next generation and so forth, the next generation will not be, that inheritor of the business will not be an entrepreneur, because he or she didn't create the business.
Mm-hmm. Okay, in the current climate, let's say post the great financial crisis, one of the things that people have noted is an absence of funding for small and medium businesses. Now the banks are generally making big campaigns saying they have money for small and medium businesses. But in your experience, how have banks and how do banks deal with small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurs in particular? What's the difference between the reality and the vision or the lip service that they pay to this segment?
Well, I think I think first of all that banks and bankers don't understand the difference between the different types of small businesses. So the inherited businesses, the mutuals, the speculators, and the real entrepreneurs, which, if I recall correctly from the research, might only be around about 4% of all businesses. So there's a tiny number there, and that's really very often where the gold dust is. I don't think bankers have any awareness of this, at least in my experience, and certainly don't in the UK, and definitely don't in Ireland.
No. Is there a point at which entrepreneurs particularly need and can use banking services, and who has actually done it well, if anyone?
I think, I think probably we're talking about the smaller community-focused banks, which will be shareholder-owned banks. The sort of smaller banks that you find, for example, in the United States, the so-called community banks in the United States, which are often owned by the family that is the major owner of the local supermarket or whatever. We see these families in Ireland. Why shouldn't these families also have banks? We're used to Ireland having 2.5 banks, but actually the country ought to have a couple of hundred banks, and we'd be a heck of a lot better for it.
So actually we're at a disadvantage after the shakeout that happened with the financial crisis, where we were left essentially with, as you say, 2.5 banks.
Well, we're at a disadvantage for sure, but we were at a disadvantage to start with, because actually what have we gone from? We've gone from sort of 4.5 banks to 2.5 banks. I think the biggest problem is that is one of reluctance to interfere with the status quo. My feeling is that the authorities they know relatively little about banking systems in other countries, particularly the concept of community banking, which you have in the United States, where these banks, by the way, are very, very successful. They know their clients very well. They're close to them. But I think that the authorities in Ireland don't want to interfere with the status quo. In all probability, investors have been given to understand that the market will not be interfered with. It will be left the way it is, and it'll be an incredibly lucrative market for a bank, for the shareholders in the 2.5 banks, as we jokingly call them, but will be a disaster really for bank customers.
Briefly, in terms of entrepreneurs, the difference between having a transactional relationship with your bank and a relationship, or transactional banking and relationship banking.
Well, I don't think that banks in Britain or in Ireland offer small businesses or individuals, or even rich individuals, any serious form of relationship banking. We've all heard of the days when there was the great bank manager who knew his or her customers. Usually it was his, of course. But those days have long since gone, and yet actually we would benefit enormously if we could get back to them, because that's what small businesses really need. They need a bank manager that understands the business, that understands the risks that might be involved in doing business with a particular client. And by the way, one of the most important things to understand too, I think, is that small businesses are net depositors with the banks. It's not generally understood that in pretty well every country I can think of, small businesses are net depositors with the banking system, and it is. I think it's certainly not in the interest of society that the banks should take those deposits and go off and speculate with them on property developments or in other activities.